Madam Speaker, excuse me, former Madam Speaker, I apologize. Can you tell me what year you became Speaker of the House the first time? The voice was slow, gentle, and dripping with Southern hospitality. It was that distinct Louisiana drawl that made everything Senator John Kennedy said sound like a casual conversation on a front porch with iced tea, rather than a high-stakes interrogation in a Senate hearing room. Kennedy leaned back in his leather chair, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose, looking at Nancy Pelosi over the top of them like a patient grandfather waiting for a grandchild to remember a simple history fact. Silence. It wasn't the silence of a politician thinking carefully about how to phrase a spin. It wasn't the calculated silence of someone weighing legal risk. It was an empty, hollow silence. It was the silence of a mind searching for a file that should have been on the desktop but had been deleted. Nancy Pelosi sat at the witness table in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room, flanked by two lawyers in suits that cost more than most cars. She stared at Senator Kennedy like he had just asked her to solve a complex differential equation in her head. Her mouth opened slightly, closed, and then opened again. The C-SPAN cameras zoomed in tight on her face. Every cable news network, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, had broken away from regular programming to cover this live. The hearing, officially titled Oversight Hearing on Congressional Stock Trading and Ethics Violations, had sounded like standard Washington theater when it was announced. People expected shouting matches, partisan bickering, and sound bites, but something about the way Pelosi looked right now changed the atmosphere in the room instantly. The blankness in her eyes, the slight confusion creasing her forehead. It told everyone watching, the staffers, the press, the millions at home, that this was going to be different. 10 seconds passed. 15. The silence became physically uncomfortable. A young staffer behind Kennedy shifted, his chair squeaking loudly in the quiet room. That was when we took back the House from the Republicans. After. She was searching, grasping at the air, like someone trying to remember a password they have typed 1,000 times, but suddenly, when it matters most, it is just gone. The synapses weren't firing. The connection wasn't there. Kennedy's voice remained gentle, almost kind. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't mock her. 2007, Kennedy said softly. Ma'am, you became Speaker in January of 2007, 17 years ago. Do you remember that? Pelosi's face flushed slightly beneath the heavy stage makeup. She straightened her spine, a reflex of muscle memory from decades of power. Of course, I remember. I was just considering the context. And what year did you become Speaker the second time? Kennedy asked immediately. Another pause. This one was longer than the first. Her lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, a silver-haired partner from a top D.C. firm, leaned over to whisper something in her ear, likely a date. But Kennedy held up a hand, stopping him. I would like Mrs. Pelosi to answer from her own memory, if you don't mind, Counselor, Kennedy said. This goes to the heart of the matter. The lawyer sat back, looking unhappy. Pelosi stared at the mahogany table in front of her, as if the answer might be carved into the wood. 2019, she finally said. I believe it was 2019. Yes, ma'am. 2019, Kennedy confirmed. And you served until January of this year, correct? When the new Congress was sworn in? Yes. So you were Speaker of the House twice, for a total of about 12 years, Kennedy summarized. One of the most powerful positions in American government. You were third in line for the presidency. You had access to the highest level of classified intelligence briefings. You voted on war authorizations. You controlled what legislation came to the floor and what died in committee. Do you remember that time? Well, of course I do, Pelosi snapped, a flash of her old irritation breaking through. I was there. Good, Kennedy said. He picked up a document from the thick stack in front of him. Then you will remember the stock trades. Let me ask you about those. He adjusted his glasses again, looking down at the paper with the meticulousness of an auditor. The room held its breath. This was the pivot. Kennedy had established the baseline. She struggled with dates. She struggled with the timeline of her own career. Now, he was going to apply that cognitive fog to the millions of dollars in her bank account. March 15th, 2020, Kennedy said. That was a Sunday, right in the middle of the early COVID panic. The world was shutting down. The markets were crashing. Do you remember that day, Mrs. Pelosi? Silence again. She blinked. Ma'am, do you remember March 15th, 2020? Pelosi's voice was quiet, lacking the boom that used to command the House floor. I remember. That was during COVID. Yes. On that day, Kennedy said, reading from the paper, you and your husband Paul purchased $5 million in call options for Pfizer stock. Call options that would pay out massively if Pfizer's stock price increased. Do you remember that trade? More silence. Kennedy looked up. Mrs. Pelosi, do you remember purchasing $5 million in Pfizer options while the country was locking down? My husband handles our investments, she recited, the line sounding robotic. I don't involve myself in the day-to-day decisions. But you signed the financial disclosure form, Kennedy countered. He held up a document. This is your signature, isn't it? Right here at the bottom. He signaled to the tech booth, and the document appeared on the massive projection screens behind the witness table. It was a standard congressional disclosure form. At the bottom, in black ink, was the signature, Nancy Pelosi. He held it up so the cameras could see, the narrator's voice would have said. Her signature was clearly visible. Pelosi stared at it. There was no recognition in her eyes. She was looking at her own signature like it belonged to a stranger. Do you remember signing this form, ma'am? I sign many documents, she deflected. This one disclosed a $5 million trade made the day before the House voted on the CARES Act, Kennedy said, his voice tightening. The first major COVID relief bill. $2 trillion. You were Speaker. You led the negotiations. And the day before the vote, your family invested $5 million in a pharmaceutical company that stood to benefit enormously from the pandemic response funding you were writing into law. Kennedy leaned forward. You don't remember that? She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Because to remember it was to admit corruption, and to forget it was to admit incompetence. She was trapped in the fog. The silence in the Senate Judiciary Committee room had transformed. At the start of the hearing, it had been the silence of anticipation. Now, it was the silence of witnessing a car crash in slow motion. It was the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a tragedy unfolding live on air. Senator Kennedy watched Nancy Pelosi with an expression that didn't look like political triumph. It looked like pity. He saw what the cameras were zooming in on. The trembling hands she tried to hide beneath the table, the vacant look that glazed over her eyes when the questions got specific. Mrs. Pelosi, Kennedy said, breaking the spell, I want to be very clear about why I am asking this. I am not trying to trick you. But that trade, March 15th, 2020, was one of the most profitable trades in congressional history. Your family made millions of dollars in a matter of weeks because you bought in right before the government flooded the market with vaccine funding. He paused, removing his glasses and setting them on the table. If you don't remember authorizing a $5 million gamble the day before a massive vote, Kennedy said, then we have to ask who did. Pelosi's lead lawyer, a man named Robert Sterling, leaned into his microphone. Senator, my client has already stated that her husband manages their portfolio. She signs the disclosures as a matter of compliance. It is routine paperwork. To suggest she has a specific memory of every administrative signature from 6 years ago is unreasonable. It wasn't administrative, Bob, Kennedy shot back, not looking at the lawyer. It was $5 million, and it was Pfizer, and it was March of 2020. Kennedy turned his focus back to the witness. Mrs. Pelosi, let's try something more recent. Maybe 2020 is too far back. He shuffled his papers, the sound amplified by the microphone. June 18, 2021, Kennedy cited. Do you remember that date? Pelosi shook her head slightly. No. On June 18, 2021, Kennedy continued, your husband purchased $2.5 million in Microsoft stock. 5 days later, June 23rd, the House, under your leadership, passed a bill authorizing $52 billion for semiconductor manufacturing and tech subsidies. Microsoft stood to benefit enormously from that bill. Kennedy peered at her. Do you remember that trade? I don't remember every... She trailed off. How about this one? Kennedy was relentless now, though his voice never raised above a conversational volume. December 3rd, 2021. Your husband bought $3 million in Tesla call options. 2 weeks later, the House passed an expanded electric vehicle tax credit that added $7,500 to the purchase price of a Tesla. It made Teslas more affordable, drove demand, and increased the stock price. Ring any bells? Pelosi's face was flushed a deep, unhealthy red. Senator, I don't coordinate my legislative work with my husband's investments. That is a conspiracy theory. I am not asking if you coordinate, Kennedy said. I am asking if you remember. He held up a stack of papers, dozens of disclosure forms clipped together. These are multi-million-dollar trades happening right before major votes, Kennedy said. Trades that made your family enormous profits. Wealth that changed your tax bracket. And you are telling me you don't remember any of them? My husband handles the investments, she repeated, retreating to the only line she had left. But you signed the disclosures, Kennedy said, tapping the stack. Your name is on these forms. Dozens of trades. Tens of millions of dollars. All perfectly timed. And you claim you don't remember any of it. Kennedy pulled out his phone. He swiped the screen and held it up, though the image was cast onto the large monitors for the audience. Let's talk about some statements you have made recently, Kennedy said. Last month, January 4th, you did an interview with CNN about this stock trading controversy. Do you remember that interview? I do many interviews, she muttered. This was 3 weeks ago, Kennedy noted, with Jake Tapper. You were asked directly about the stock trades. Let me show you what you said. He tapped the play button. A video played on the screen behind Pelosi. Her own voice, strong and defiant, filled the room. I have never, ever used my position to benefit financially. My husband makes his own investment decisions, and I am proud of his success. Kennedy paused the video. Do you stand by that statement? Okay, Kennedy said. Now, 3 days later, January 7th, you did an interview with MSNBC. Nicole Wallace asked you about the same topic. Let me show you that one. Another video clip played. Pelosi looked slightly more tired in this one. Look, Maybe some of the trades look bad in hindsight. Maybe we should have been more careful about timing. But there was no intentional coordination between my office and my husband's investments. Kennedy paused it. Do you see the problem, Mrs. Pelosi? She looked confused, squinting at the screen. I don't. On January 4th, you said you never used your position to benefit financially. Total denial, Kennedy explained. 3 days later, you said, maybe we should have been more careful about timing. An admission of error. Those are contradictory statements. Either you did something wrong and should have been more careful, or you did nothing wrong at all. Which is it? Those statements aren't contradictory, she stammered. I was saying. Ma'am, they are 3 days apart, Kennedy said. You gave 2 different answers to the same question in the same week. Why? Pelosi opened her mouth, then closed it. The panic was rising in her throat. I was trying to explain the nuance. Let me show you more, Kennedy said, reaching for a printed transcript. January 10th. You told a reporter from Fox News, quote, I don't recall the specific trades my husband made. That is a direct quote. Do you remember saying that? If that is what the transcript says. But then, on January 12th, Kennedy read, you told Politico, quote, those trades were made on sound financial advice from experienced professionals. Kennedy took off his glasses again. So, which is it? He asked. You don't recall the trades? Or you know they were based on sound advice? How can you defend trades as being based on sound advice if you don't recall the trades themselves? There was no answer. Kennedy leaned back in his chair. He looked at the woman who had once terrified the Republican caucus, the woman whose whip count was legendary, the woman who remembered every favor owed and every grudge held. Mrs. Pelosi, Kennedy said, in the past month alone, you have given contradictory statements about the same topic to different media outlets. You cannot keep your story straight from one interview to the next. Combined with your inability to remember basic facts, like who the current Senate Majority Leader is, I am genuinely concerned about your memory. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. And that leads me to the question nobody wants to ask, but I have to ask. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice gentle but piercing. Mrs. Pelosi, do you know what day it is today? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade that had been hoisted but not yet dropped. It was a simple question, a kindergarten question. The kind of question doctors ask accident victims to check for concussions. But, in the ornate hearing room of the Senate Judiciary Committee, it felt like an accusation. Nancy Pelosi looked up at Senator Kennedy. Then she looked at the table. Then she looked to her left, at her lead attorney, Robert Sterling. Everyone watching, the senators, the press corps, the millions glued to the live feed, saw the same thing. They saw the search. They saw the frantic, terrified scanning of a mind trying to find a landmark in a fog that had suddenly become opaque. She didn't know. 5 seconds passed. 10. In the silence, you could hear the shutter clicks of the cameras, a rapid-fire mechanical cricket sound. Sterling, realizing the catastrophe unfolding in real time, leaned in close. He covered his mouth with his hand, but the microphone on the table was sensitive. It was high fidelity. It picked up the whisper clearly, broadcasting it to the entire room and the C-SPAN audience. It's Thursday. Pelosi nodded, a quick, jerky motion. She turned back to Kennedy, attempting to regain the imperious posture that had defined her career. Thursday, she said. Her voice was steady, but it was too late. The illusion had shattered. Kennedy didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant. He looked profoundly sad. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the stack of papers. "Your lawyer just told you that," Kennedy said quietly. I was confirming," she stammered. "Did you know it was Thursday before he told you?" Kennedy asked. There was no answer, just a stare that was becoming increasingly glassy. "Mrs. Pelosi," Kennedy said, pushing gently. "What is the date?" This time she didn't look at her lawyer. She looked frozen. The panic was visible now, rising in her chest, flushing her neck. She knew she should know this. It was January. She knew that much. But the number? The specific day? It was gone. It was just a blank white space where a number should be. Sterling leaned in again. The whisper was harsher this time. Urgent. "January 22nd. January 22nd, Pelosi repeated instantly, like a child reciting a lesson in school. Kennedy sat back in his leather chair. The hearing room was dead silent. No one was shifting papers. No one was checking their phones. They were witnessing the end of an era, and it wasn't happening with a bang, but with a whisper. "Mrs. Pelosi," Kennedy said, his voice soft, devoid of any partisan edge. "I have to ask this, and I take no joy in asking it. Are you currently under a doctor's care for memory problems?" The question sucked the oxygen out of the room. Until that moment, the hearing had been about corruption. It had been about greed. It had been about whether a powerful politician used her position to enrich her family. Those were standard Washington scandals. They were ugly, but they were familiar. But this was something else. This was a question of competence. This was a question of whether the woman who had been second in line to the presidency, who had wielded the gavel for 12 years, who had shaped the Affordable Care Act and led 2 impeachments, had been making decisions while her mind was actively failing. Sterling practically jumped out of his chair. "Mr. Chairman, this is outrageous. This is a medical inquiry that has no relevance to the subject of this hearing. I object in the strongest possible terms. This is ageism, plain and simple." Kennedy didn't look at Sterling. He kept his eyes locked on Pelosi. "It is directly relevant, Counselor," Kennedy said, his drawl cutting through the lawyer's bluster. "Because we are talking about complex financial decisions. We are talking about the timing of trades relative to classified briefings. If your client cannot remember what day of the week it is, how can she possibly remember whether she authorized a $5 million trade?" Kennedy leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Here is the reality we are looking at," Kennedy said to Pelosi. "Either you made these trades knowingly, which means you used your position for personal gain. That is corruption. Or," Kennedy continued, "you didn't make them knowingly. You didn't know what you were signing. You didn't know what was happening with your own accounts because you weren't cognitively capable of tracking it." "And if that is the case," Kennedy said, "then someone else, your husband, your staff, your advisors, was using your power without your oversight. That is fraud. And that is a national security risk." He paused. "So, I will ask again. Have you been evaluated for cognitive impairment?" Pelosi's hands were shaking visibly now. She clasped them together on the table, trying to steady them, but the tremor traveled up her arms. I am completely competent," she said, her voice thin. "I have served this country for 38 years. "I know you have, ma'am," Kennedy said respectfully. "And no one is questioning your past service. We are questioning your current capacity." "You couldn't tell me the year you became Speaker," Kennedy listed, counting on his fingers. "You couldn't tell me who the Senate Majority Leader is. You guessed Mitch McConnell. You couldn't tell me the date. You couldn't tell me the day of the week." "These aren't gotcha questions," Kennedy said. These are the basics. And if you can't handle the basics, how can you explain the complex trading patterns of your portfolio? Kennedy reached down and pulled a new document from his briefcase. It was thick, bound with a heavy black spiral coil, easily 200 pages. He dropped it onto the desk with a heavy thud that echoed in the quiet room. "Mrs. Pelosi," Kennedy said, "3 weeks ago, you were deposed as part of a civil lawsuit related to these stock trades, a shareholder lawsuit against some of the tech companies involved. You were deposed under oath for 4 hours. Do you remember that deposition?" Pelosi blinked, trying to reorient herself. The shift from the medical questions back to legal ones seemed to confuse her further. Yes, I remember being deposed." "Good," Kennedy said. "Do you remember how many times you answered, 'I don't recall,' or 'I don't remember,' during that 4-hour session?" She stared at him. The number wasn't in her head. "You don't remember how many times you said you don't remember?" Kennedy asked, letting the irony hang there for a moment. "Let me tell you," Kennedy said. 76 times. A murmur rippled through the gallery. 76 times in 4 hours meant she was pleading ignorance every 3 minutes. Kennedy opened the transcript to a tabbed page. "Let me read you some of the questions you couldn't remember the answers to," Kennedy said. Page 23. "Do you remember discussing the CARES Act legislation with your husband in March 2020? Your answer, 'I don't recall.'" He flipped a chunk of pages. Page 47. "Do you remember when you first learned about your husband's purchase of Pfizer call options?" Your answer, "I don't recall." He flipped again. Page 68. "Do you remember signing the financial disclosure form for the Microsoft purchase?" Your answer, "I don't recall." Page 91. "Do you remember attending a classified briefing on semiconductor supply chains before the CHIPS Act vote?" Your answer, "I don't recall." Kennedy looked up over his reading glasses. "Mrs. Pelosi, these aren't trivial questions. These aren't asking what you had for lunch 3 years ago. These are major events. Classified briefings that only a handful of people in the country have access to," Kennedy emphasized. "Multi-million-dollar trades that doubled your family's net worth. Signature legislation that defined your speakership." "And you don't remember any of it?" Sterling interjected again. "Senator, depositions are adversarial proceedings. Lawyers advise witnesses to be careful with their answers. 'I don't recall' is a standard legal response to avoid perjury if one is unsure of the specific details." "I understand how depositions work, Counselor," Kennedy drawled. "I have taken hundreds of them. But there is a difference between being careful and having no memory." "And here is the real problem," Kennedy said. "Here is where the 'I don't recall' defense falls apart." He flipped to a different section of the transcript, marked with a red tag. "On page 47 of this deposition," Kennedy said, "you were asked, 'Do you discuss investment strategies with your husband?' Your answer was unequivocal. 'No. My husband handles all of our investments independently. We do not discuss them.'" Kennedy nodded, accepting the premise for a moment. "But then," he said, flipping forward about 50 pages, "on page 103, you were asked, 'Did you ever talk with your husband about market trends or economic conditions?' And you answered, 'Occasionally, we discuss general economic trends, like any married couple might. Inflation, jobs, that sort of thing.'" Kennedy looked up, his brow furrowed. "So, which is it, Mrs. Pelosi? You don't discuss investments with him at all? Or you occasionally discuss economic trends?" "Because," Kennedy noted, "if you are the Speaker of the House, and you are discussing general economic trends with your husband, You aren't just chatting about the price of milk. You are discussing legislation. You are discussing federal spending. You are discussing interest rates. Those answers contradict each other, Kennedy said. And they are from the same deposition, 50 pages apart. Pelosi looked flustered, her hands fluttering slightly. I was trying to distinguish between specific trades and general conversations about the economy. There is a difference. But you can't remember either, Kennedy exclaimed softly. You said, I don't recall 76 times. You can't remember the conversations, but you also can't consistently describe whether the conversations happened at all. Kennedy leaned back, looking at the woman who had once been the master of detail, the woman who could count votes down to the single digits. Mrs. Pelosi, Kennedy said, I am going to be direct with you because I think you deserve directness, and the American people deserve the truth. In the past month, you have given contradictory public statements. In your deposition, you claimed not to remember anything 76 times. Today, you have struggled to remember what year you became Speaker, who the Senate Majority Leader is, and you needed your lawyer to tell you what day it is. I am concerned, Kennedy said. I am deeply concerned. If you were making these decisions, if you were signing these forms, while unable to remember them, then who was really running the House of Representatives? The question hung in the air, heavier than any accusation of theft. Corruption was one thing. A shadow presidency run by staff and spouses because the elected leader was incapacitated? That was a constitutional crisis. I was running the House, Pelosi said, her voice trembling with indignation but lacking force. I was the Speaker. Then answer my questions, Kennedy said simply. Prove it. What was the date of the Pfizer trade? What year did you become Speaker the first time? She looked down. She was searching again. She couldn't find the file. What did you have for breakfast this morning? A long pause. She blinked rapidly. She genuinely couldn't remember. What day of the week is it? Her lawyer leaned in to whisper again, but Kennedy slammed his hand on the table, a rare display of anger. No, Kennedy barked. Counselor, if you whisper the answer to her one more time, I will have you removed from this hearing room. She must answer. He turned back to Pelosi. Mrs. Pelosi, what day is it? She looked panic-stricken. She looked at her lawyer, who was staring straight ahead, terrified to move. She looked at Kennedy. It is January, she guessed. January? 22nd? That is the date, Kennedy said softly. What is the day? Monday? Tuesday? She stared at him. The fog was total. I don't... She stopped. Kennedy sat back. He didn't ask another question. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. Senator John Kennedy looked at Nancy Pelosi, and for a moment, the mask of the prosecutor slipped. He didn't look like a man trying to win a soundbite for Fox News. He looked like a man watching a tragedy he hadn't fully anticipated. He sat back in his chair, folding his hands over the stack of damning transcripts. Mr. Chairman, Kennedy said, his voice quiet but carrying to the back of the room. I move that we request a formal cognitive evaluation of the witness before proceeding further with this investigation. The room detonated. It wasn't a gavel bang or a shout. It was an explosion of overlapping voices. The Democratic side of the dais erupted in outrage. "This is outrageous!" shouted a senior senator from New York, slamming his hand on the table. "You are attacking a woman based on her age. This is ageism. This is sexism. This is beneath the dignity of the Senate." "It is a political hit job disguised as medical concern," another senator yelled. Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice to match them. He waited for the noise to crest and break, sitting patiently while the accusations flew. When the chairman finally banged the gavel enough times to restore a semblance of order, Kennedy leaned into his microphone. "Mr. Chairman," Kennedy said, ignoring the glaring looks from across the aisle, "I am not attacking Mrs. Pelosi. I am looking at the facts." He gestured to the woman sitting frozen at the witness table. "This woman had access to our nation's most sensitive intelligence for 12 years, Kennedy said. She voted on authorizations for military force. She controlled trillion-dollar budgets. She was third in line for the presidency. And she is sitting here today," Kennedy continued, "unable to remember basic facts about her own career. Unable to tell us who the Senate Majority Leader is. Unable to tell us what day it is without her lawyer whispering it to her." Kennedy looked directly at the cameras. "If there is cognitive impairment, and I believe the evidence shows there is, the American people have a right to know. This is not about politics. This is about national security." A Republican senator, a former prosecutor from Texas, jumped in to support the motion. "The trades speak for themselves," he argued. $140 million in gains over 12 years. Perfect timing. Again and again. Either she is lying about not remembering, which is perjury, or she is genuinely impaired. "And here is the problem," the Texas senator added. "If she was cognitively impaired while making these trades, that means someone else was using her position and her access for financial gain." "That is fraud," he said. "That is elder abuse. That is potentially criminal conspiracy involving her staff or her husband." The room fell silent again as the implication landed. The defense of memory loss wasn't a shield. It was an indictment of everyone around her. Kennedy turned back to the witness. Pelosi was staring straight ahead, her face rigid. She looked like a statue that was beginning to crack. "Ma'am," Kennedy said gently, "I am not trying to embarrass you, but I am trying to get to the truth." "And the truth is," Kennedy said, "you cannot answer basic questions. You cannot remember your own statements from 3 weeks ago. So, I have to ask you one more time, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you remember making these stock trades?" Silence. Long, painful silence. She was staring at the table, her hands gripping the wood so hard her knuckles were white. "Do you remember the classified briefings that preceded these trades?" Kennedy pressed. Her hands were shaking visibly now, a tremor she couldn't suppress. "Do you know where you are right now?" She looked up at him, and in her eyes, for just a fleeting second, there was a flash of clarity, a spark of the old Nancy Pelosi, the tactician, the warrior, the woman who had dominated Washington for decades. In that flash, she knew. She knew what he was doing. She knew she had lost the thread. She knew it was over. But then, the spark went out. The blankness returned. The confusion. The searching. "I am in—" "This is the Senate," she said, her voice wavering. "It is a Senate hearing room." "Yes." "Do you know why you are here?" Kennedy asked. "Stock trading," she whispered. "Do you remember the trades?" She looked to her left. She looked to her right. She looked lost. Suddenly, there was movement in the audience. Nancy Pelosi's chief of staff, a man who had been with her for 20 years, stood up from the row behind the witness table. He didn't wait for permission. He rushed forward, breaching the protocol of the hearing, and leaned down to whisper urgently in her ear. The cameras caught it all. The panic in his face. The confusion in hers. The way he gripped her shoulder, not like a staffer supporting a boss, but like a caregiver guiding a patient. "We need to go," the microphone picked up his whisper. "Now." Pelosi stood up suddenly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I don't have to sit here," she declared, her voice shrill and trembling. "I don't have to sit here and be attacked with conspiracy theories." "Ma'am, these aren't conspiracy theories," Kennedy said calmly, remaining seated. "These are your financial disclosures, your deposition transcript, your public statements, all public record, all documented. I am just asking you to remember them." "I am done with this hearing," she shouted. She began gathering her things. Her hands were shaking so badly she fumbled her phone. It clattered to the floor. She stared at it, unable to react. One of her lawyers bent down and picked it up for her. The chairman banged his gavel. "Mrs. Pelosi, you are still under subpoena. You cannot just leave." But she was already moving. Her lawyers had risen, each taking one of her elbows to support her. She looked unsteady on her feet, confused, like she wasn't quite sure where the exit was. Kennedy called after her, his voice still that calm Louisiana drawl, echoing through the chaotic room. "Mrs. Pelosi," Kennedy warned, "if you leave, we will have no choice but to refer this matter to the Department of Justice for a criminal investigation into the trades, and to refer the question of your cognitive capacity to the House Ethics Committee." She stopped at the heavy wooden doors. She turned back for one final moment. The old Nancy Pelosi was there, imperious, defiant, powerful. She raised her chin. "Do what you have to do, Senator." And she turned and walked out. The heavy doors closed behind her with a finality that felt historic. Inside the hearing room, pandemonium erupted. Senators were shouting over each other. Reporters were yelling questions that no one could answer. Camera flashes were going off like strobe lights. But the real story was happening in the hallway. The cameras stationed outside caught the exit. They caught the confused look on Pelosi's face as the bright lights of the hallway hit her. They caught the way her chief of staff had to guide her by the arm, steering her away from the press. They caught the lawyer carrying her briefcase because she had forgotten it. They caught the way she stumbled slightly near the elevator, her legs betraying her, and how the security detail had to catch her. Back inside, Senator Kennedy sat calmly amidst the chaos. He stacked his papers into a neat pile. He put his reading glasses back in their case. He didn't speak to the press immediately. He let the empty chair at the witness table do the talking. Within minutes, the footage was everywhere. It wasn't the full 4-hour hearing that went viral. It was the devastating clips, the moments of absolute failure. Clip 1. "What year did you become Speaker?" Long, confused pause. Clip 2. "Who is the Senate Majority Leader?" Schumer? No. McConnell? Clip 3. "Do you remember these trades?" Blank stare. But the clip that broke the internet, the one that would be played in history classes 50 years from now, was just 23 seconds long. It showed Kennedy asking gently, "Mrs. Pelosi, what day of the week is it?" It showed her looking lost. It showed her lawyer covering his mouth and whispering, "Thursday." It showed her repeating, "Thursday," like a child reciting a lesson she didn't understand. That clip got 40 million views in 6 hours. The reaction was swift and brutal. Medical experts were on cable news within the hour. Neurologists, geriatric specialists, and cognitive experts who usually avoided diagnosing public figures felt compelled to speak. Those are classic signs of significant cognitive impairment, a neurologist on CNN explained, pointing to the footage. The blank stares, the inability to retrieve basic information, the word searching. The fact that she needed prompting for the day of the week suggests this is more than just normal aging. This looks like advanced decline. Even the Democrats started hedging. They didn't defend her. They couldn't. "We love Nancy," a prominent Democratic strategist said on MSNBC. "She is a giant. But if there are health concerns, obviously Mrs. Pelosi should prioritize her well-being." The questions raised today are legitimate. By Friday morning, Pelosi's office released a statement. It was brief, carefully worded, and written by lawyers. Congresswoman Pelosi is taking a temporary leave from her congressional duties to undergo a comprehensive medical evaluation. She remains committed to serving her constituents and looks forward to returning to work soon. Translation: It is over. On Monday, the other shoe dropped. The Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into the stock trades, not just because of the hearing, but because the hearing had changed the legal landscape. If Nancy Pelosi was cognitively impaired, she couldn't have formed criminal intent. But that didn't make the trades legal. It meant someone else, her husband, her staff, her advisors, had been making the decisions using her position. That was fraud. That was unauthorized access to classified information. That was a conspiracy. Paul Pelosi, her husband, was subpoenaed to testify. His lawyer immediately announced he would invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. That silence was louder than any confession. By Wednesday, 3 House Democrats, members who had been Pelosi's closest allies for decades, went public. They didn't call for her prosecution. They called for her resignation. "We love Nancy," they wrote in a joint letter. "She is a trailblazer. But if she is experiencing cognitive difficulties, she needs to focus on her health, not on representing constituents. The kindest thing we can do is encourage her to step back." The polls came out on Friday. They were devastating. 71% of voters believed Pelosi should resign. 54% of Democrats believed she should resign. 63% believed she had engaged in insider trading. But the killer question, the one that ended her career, was this: do you believe Nancy Pelosi knowingly made the stock trades in question? Yes, 44%. No, 37% unsure, 19%. That no, combined with the unsure, meant that 56% of Americans thought she was either too corrupt to be honest or too impaired to know what she was doing. Either way, she was unfit. 10 days after the hearing, the announcement came. Nancy Pelosi didn't hold a press conference. She didn't stand before the cameras one last time. She released a written statement on a Friday afternoon, the classic news dump timing used to bury bad news. After 38 years of service in the House of Representatives, and after consultation with my family and my doctors, I have decided to retire from Congress to focus on my health. I am proud of my accomplishments, from the Affordable Care Act to the American Rescue Plan. I leave knowing that I fought for working families. I thank the people of San Francisco for the honor of representing them. She didn't mention the stock trades. She didn't mention the hearing. She didn't mention Senator Kennedy. She didn't address the fact that she couldn't remember the date. She just faded away. But the legal machine Kennedy had started didn't stop. 3 months later, the Justice Department charged Paul Pelosi with 27 counts of securities fraud and insider trading. Each count corresponded to a trade that had been made within days of Nancy receiving classified information. He pleaded guilty. Part of the plea deal was explicit. Nancy Pelosi would not be charged. The prosecutors concluded that due to her cognitive decline, they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had knowingly participated in the scheme during the final years. It was the ultimate indignity. She wasn't prosecuted because she was deemed too broken to be responsible. Paul got 18 months in federal prison and a $10 million fine. Nancy Pelosi disappeared from public life. Her Twitter account went silent. Her staff disbanded. Occasionally, there were sightings. TMZ published photos of her being helped into a car outside a medical facility in San Francisco. She looked small, frail, confused. Nothing like the titan who had once ripped up a president's speech on live television. John Kennedy gave one final interview to a local Louisiana paper. "Did you feel bad?" the reporter asked. "Exposing her like that?" Kennedy paused, looking out the window. "I felt bad for the country," Kennedy said. "We had someone in a position of immense power, third in line for the presidency, who couldn't remember what day of the week it was." "But did you feel bad for her personally?" "Of course I did," Kennedy said softly. "I wouldn't wish cognitive decline on anyone. It robs you of yourself. It is cruel." "But here is the thing," Kennedy added, his voice hardening. "It isn't her fault that her memory was failing. That is age. That is nature. What is someone's fault? Is the system that kept her in power, even as everyone around her could see she was declining. Her staff knew, her colleagues knew, leadership knew, and they kept her there because she was useful, because she could raise money, because she was a symbol." He looked at the reporter. "I didn't end Nancy Pelosi's career to be cruel. I did it because the American people deserve to know that the person making decisions on their behalf is capable of remembering what those decisions are." "That isn't partisan," Kennedy said. "That is just accountability." A year after her resignation, Nancy Pelosi was moved to a memory care facility in San Francisco. She was 86 years old. She had been one of the most powerful humans on Earth. And in the end, it wasn't a political opponent, a scandal, or an election that defeated her. It was a simple question. She couldn't answer. And that silence told the world everything it needed to know. The heavy wooden doors of the hearing room closed behind Nancy Pelosi with a finality that felt historic. Inside, pandemonium erupted. Senators were shouting over each other, banging their hands on the dais. Reporters were yelling questions that no one could answer, their voices merging into a wall of noise. Camera flashes went off like strobe lights, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. But the real story, the one that would define the next 24 hours, was happening in the hallway. The cameras stationed outside caught the exit. They caught the confused, almost frightened look on Pelosi's face as the bright lights of the corridor hit her. They caught the way her chief of staff had to guide her by the arm, steering her away from the shouting press pack like a caregiver guiding a patient. They caught the lawyer carrying her briefcase because she had forgotten it on the table. They caught the way she stumbled slightly near the elevator, her legs betraying her, and how the security detail had to reach out to steady her. Back inside, Senator Kennedy sat calmly amidst the chaos. He stacked his papers into a neat pile, aligning the edges with precise, slow movements. He put his reading glasses back in their case and snapped it shut. He didn't speak to the press immediately. He let the empty chair at the witness table do the talking. It wasn't the full 4-hour hearing that went viral. It wasn't the detailed questions about the CARES Act or the semiconductor subsidies. It was the devastating clips, the moments of absolute, undeniable failure. But the clip that broke the internet, the one that would be played in history classes 50 years from now as the moment the gerontocracy collapsed, was just 23 seconds long. It showed Kennedy asking gently, "Mrs. Pelosi, what day of the week is it?" It showed her looking lost, scanning the room for help. It showed her lawyer covering his mouth and whispering, "Thursday." It showed her repeating, "Thursday." like a child reciting a lesson she didn't understand. The reaction was swift, brutal, and impossible to spin. Those are classic signs of significant cognitive impairment, a neurologist on CNN explained, pointing to the footage frozen on the screen. The blank stares, the inability to retrieve basic information, the word searching. The fact that she needed prompting for the day of the week suggests this is more than just normal aging. This looks like advanced decline. Even the Democrats started hedging. They didn't defend her. They couldn't. The visual evidence was too overwhelming. "We love Nancy," a prominent Democratic strategist said on MSNBC, looking uncomfortable. "She is a giant. But if there are health concerns, obviously Mrs. Pelosi should prioritize her well-being. The questions raised today are legitimate." By Friday morning, Pelosi's office released a statement. It was brief, carefully worded, and clearly written by lawyers trying to build a legal defense against the coming storm. The Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into the stock trades, not just because of the hearing, but because the hearing had changed the legal landscape entirely. If Nancy Pelosi was cognitively impaired, as the hearing suggested, she couldn't have formed criminal intent. But that didn't make the trades legal. It meant someone else, her husband, her staff, her advisors, had been making the decisions using her position. Nancy Pelosi didn't hold a press conference. She didn't stand before the cameras one last time to say goodbye to the institution she had ruled for decades. She released a written statement on a Friday afternoon, the classic news dump timing used to bury bad news. But the legal machine Kennedy had started didn't stop. It couldn't stop. Part of the plea deal was explicit. Nancy Pelosi would not be charged. The prosecutors concluded that due to her documented cognitive decline, they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had knowingly participated in the scheme during the final years. It was the ultimate indignity. She wasn't prosecuted because she was deemed too broken to be responsible. She was saved by her own incompetence. Kennedy paused, looking out the window of his office. She was 86 years old. She had been one of the most powerful humans on Earth. She had shaped the 21st century. And in the end, it wasn't a political opponent, a scandal, or an election that defeated her. The story of Nancy Pelosi didn't end with her resignation. In fact, for the people of Washington, D.C., the real reckoning was just beginning. While Nancy Pelosi disappeared into the privacy of medical retirement, a new question began to haunt the Capitol. If she didn't know what she was doing for the last 2 years, who did? Senator Kennedy's questioning had exposed the vacancy at the top, but it was the FBI investigation that exposed the machinery underneath. 3 months after Pelosi left office, federal prosecutors turned their attention to the shadow staff, the inner circle of aides, advisors, and family members who had effectively been running the Speaker's office while the Speaker herself drifted into the fog. The first domino to fall was Jonathan Miller, her chief of staff for 20 years, the man who had rushed the hearing room floor to whisper the answers in her ear. He was subpoenaed by the House Ethics Committee. The hearing was less dramatic than Pelosi's, but far more revealing. "Mr. Miller," the chairman asked, "when Mrs. Pelosi signed the financial disclosure forms for the Pfizer trade, did she read them?" Miller sat stiffly. He wasn't old or confused. He was sharp, calculated, and currently terrified of a perjury charge. The Speaker relied on staff to prepare the documents, Miller said carefully. "That is not what I asked," the chairman countered. "Did she read them? Did she understand them? Or did you just put a pen in her hand and point to the line?" Miller hesitated. The image of the Thursday whisper was still fresh in everyone's mind. Towards the end, Miller admitted quietly, her focus was variable. We often had to guide her through the administrative processes. Administrative processes? The chairman asked incredulously. You mean trading millions of dollars? You mean negotiating trillion-dollar spending bills? You were guiding her hand? The investigation revealed a terrifying reality. For nearly 2 years, the Speaker of the House had been a figurehead. Legislation was being written, negotiated, and approved by unelected staffers who used Pelosi's authority as a rubber stamp. Stock trades were being executed by a husband who knew his wife wasn't checking the details. It was a shadow speaker. Miller was eventually indicted for conspiracy to defraud the United States. He had knowingly allowed an incapacitated official to remain in power to preserve his own influence. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of making false statements and was banned from federal employment for life. But the cultural fallout was even significant. The Pelosi standard became the new rule of engagement in Washington. Every time an aging senator froze during a speech, every time a congressman stumbled over a name, the clip was compared to the Pelosi hearing. Is this another Thursday moment? The pundits would ask. The cover-up was no longer possible. The code of silence that protected the geriatric elite of Washington had been shattered by John Kennedy's simple question. Voters demanded cognitive tests. Challengers demanded debates without notes. The era of the forever politician, the leader who stays until they literally cannot remember their own name, was over. The voters had seen the cost of it. They had seen the corruption that festers when the watchman falls asleep. 1 year later, Senator John Kennedy sat in his office in the Russell Building. The chaos of the hearing had long since faded. The news cycle had moved on. But the impact of that morning remained. A young reporter from a history magazine was interviewing him for a retrospective piece on the end of the gerontocracy. Senator, the reporter asked, do you think history will judge you harshly for what you did? Some people still say it was cruel to expose a woman in that condition. Kennedy took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked tired. History, Kennedy said with his slow drawl, is not about being nice. History is about what happened. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Capitol dome shining in the sunlight. We had a situation where the most powerful woman in the legislative branch was not home, Kennedy said. The lights were on, the motorcade was running, the press releases were going out, but she was not home. And because she wasn't home, Kennedy continued, people looted the house. Her husband looted the stock market. Her staff looted her authority. The system looted the taxpayers. They used her. They used her name, her signature, and her power because they knew she couldn't stop them. He turned back to the reporter. Exposing that wasn't cruelty, Kennedy said firmly. It was a rescue mission. We rescued the country from a shadow government. And in a way, we rescued her, too. We stopped them from using her as a prop. The legacy of the Pelosi hearing wasn't just the Pelosi Act. The bipartisan bill passed 6 months later that mandated annual cognitive screenings for any federal official over the age of 75. The real legacy was the awakening of the American public. For decades, Americans had assumed that the people in charge knew what they were doing. They assumed that there was a plan. They assumed that the adults were in the room. Kennedy showed them the terrifying truth. Sometimes the room is empty. Sometimes the person with their finger on the button doesn't know what day it is. Nancy Pelosi lived out her remaining years in quiet comfort in San Francisco. surrounded by memory care specialists who treated her with the dignity she deserved as a human being, removed from the power she could no longer wield. But in Washington, the ghost of her final hearing lingered. Every time a politician thought about clinging to power a little too long, every time a staffer thought about hiding their boss's decline to keep their job, they remembered the silence. They remembered the question. And they remembered that eventually, someone would ask it. Narrator voice returns. The fall of Nancy Pelosi was not a tragedy of age. It was a tragedy of hubris. It was a warning that power without competence is dangerous, and that a system that protects its leaders from accountability eventually rots from the inside. John Kennedy didn't just ask a question. He popped a bubble. If this story made you think about who is really running our government, hit that like button. If you believe we need term limits and cognitive tests for our leaders, share this video. And if you want to see who else is hiding behind the curtain, subscribe. Because the questions are just getting started.